Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Aoife Nolan. I'm Director of the Human Rights Law Centre at the University of Nottingham, and I'm delighted to invite you to this event on behalf of the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Development, the World Future Council, Child Rights Connect, and the Human Rights Law Centre. Now, this evening's event, Future Generations' Rights After the Summit of the Future, forms part of the Development Dialogues event series. And these ongoing dialogues, which are organised by the mandate on the right to development, seek to provide a platform to discuss a range of topical issues related to the right to development in a constructive way. And we are absolutely delighted to have so many people here this evening. Just a reminder as we begin, again, that this event is being recorded, and we're doing so in order to have a record of it and of the conversation that we hope will develop in it. A quick word on format. We're going to kick off this hour-long event with a series of, brief interventions, short interventions of about 5 minutes each from our speakers, outlining some key thoughts. And then we'll turn to a moderated conversation involving questions from yourself, from audience members, and of course, the speakers themselves. And if you have questions, please do add them to the Q&A section, which you should be able to see at the bottom of your bar on the Zoom platform. I just want to begin with a safeguarding reminder to attendees. And our aim with this event is to be a safe and inclusive environment, free from any form of discrimination, exploitation, abuse, or harassment. And we would ask you to please listen to and respect the opinions, ideas, and experiences of others, including taking participating children seriously. And please refrain from inappropriate language. We request that you do not exchange contact information with the children participating and do not take their photos during the online event. Please don't take them, and please do not share them on social media. Any safeguarding concerns can be directed to Julie Murray, who's joining us from Save the Children, who will be putting her email contact details in the Q&A. Anyway, so that's the organisation. So we're meeting here, I suppose, roughly a month after this very important international meeting hosted by the UN Secretary General that was held in New York, called the Summit of the Future, the aim of which was to hammer out an agenda for the future, to deal with contemporary challenges and future challenges in a way to ensure enjoyment of rights related to well-being, development, survival, flourishing, etc. Two key documents emerged from the Summit of the Future: a pact and declaration on future generations. And these will be part of our key discussions here today. As we face into a situation in which young people, and generations that have yet to be born, that are not yet alive, future generations, as we face into this situation where the challenges faced by these groups are huge and constantly growing, serious questions have to be asked about the position of future generations' rights, and indeed of future generations more generally in the international human rights law framework following this huge meeting that was promised to be transformative. We're going to explore some of the key issues thrown up by that meeting, the things that were dealt with in the documents coming out of it, the things that weren't dealt with it. And we're going to put our heads together and try to have, to think very seriously about how we can use the outcomes of the summit to really push forward progress and change for children, young people, and particularly future generations. Our first speaker this evening is Surya Deva, who will be well known to many of you as the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Development. Surya, if you wouldn't mind just giving a few of your thoughts following the Summit of the Future of the Development, and of course, also drawing on your recent report on the rights of children and right to development of children and future generations.
Thank you very much, Aoife, and hello everyone. Pleased to be joining with very distinguished panel, and also we are located geographically in very different part of the world, so that's also very diverse. And of course, we have gender, and very glad to have Nicole as the child advocate as part of this conversation. In my remarks, I will just focus on two aspects. And of course, participants are more than welcome to glance through my report and other relevant documents, including the Declaration of Generations, and of course, the scholarship of IFA and others on this particular issue. The first starting point is that the future generations' needs and interest, that is something which is inherent in the very idea of sustainable development. So the 1987 famous definition of sustainable development talks about that we have to consider the needs of the present generation, but at the same time, we have to ensure that the ability of the future generations to meet their future needs are not undermined. Similarly, right to development is one of the most progressive human rights, in my view, when it comes to the rights of future generations, or at least the needs and the interest of future generations. Because the Rio Declaration Principle 3 articulates very clearly, and the same is repeated in the paragraph 11 of the Vienna Declaration, that we have to realize the right to development without compromising the development and the environmental needs of the future generations. And it's quite significant that these things were stated in early 1990s. And of course, we have more recent articulation in the Maastricht Principles, and Sandy will talk about that. And of course, the Pact for the Future and other documents. So in my report, I propose that if we have to take the rights of the future generations seriously, there should be a policy shift. And I make 4 concrete recommendations. So I'll briefly mention those recommendations, and I will close with that. My first recommendation is that it is crucial we use the language of rights in relation to future generations, not merely needs and interests. Because when we talk about the language of rights, it imposes corresponding obligations on states and other actors. I also suggest that we should think of this idea of future generations, the concept beyond human beings, and we should look at non-human species as part of multi-species justice. The second recommendation I make is that we should embed the intergenerational equity in the decision-making processes, and that is where impact assessment processes or due diligence processes done by governments or companies are very relevant. The third recommendation I make is that we need to ensure somehow that the representatives of future generations are able to participate meaningfully in those decisions. And law can allow those tools. For instance, we can create a legal fiction, how trustees and guardians of the future generations can participate on those decisions that are being made now. And final recommendation is that we have to consider the impact of our financial planning and budgeting on future generations. For instance, if natural resources are getting exploited and we generate some revenue, should we create future fund where X percentage of that revenue is preserved to protect the rights of the future generations? So I will stop at this for now. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you so much, Surya. And I'm sure we'll come back to this issue of the use of language of rights later on, because of course, one of the things that was very striking when we look at the documents that emerged from the future of the summit, whether it's the Pact for the Future or the Declaration on Future Generations, is that whereas we do see human rights talked about, and we do see statements that, you know, decision making and policy making must take into account the needs and interests of generations to come. We see that there was very careful avoidance of any language of the rights of future generations. And I'm sure we'll come back to that in future presentations. So we're seeing a push for a shift in policy, but we're not seeing the language of rights, for instance. It is now, so thank you for that. And, you know, please, people, can I ask people to add your questions again in the Q&A for Surya and for, you know, everyone else as we go along. It's now an enormous pleasure for me to present Nicole, who is a 17-year-old climate activist from Zimbabwe. Nicole attended the summit of the Future Action Days, and in preparation, she traveled across Zimbabwe, meeting with other children to hear their views and recommendations on the challenges that they face. Nicole is in her second term as a member of the National Junior Parliament, where she serves as the Deputy Minister of the Environment, Climate Change and Wildlife Management. She is also the executive member of Save the Children Zimbabwe's advisory board. Nicole, it would be wonderful if you felt able to share some thoughts with us now.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So my experience at the Summit of the Future Action Days is that the adult to children ratio was very poor because we had many adults there and the children were able to attend the action days only, not the Summit of the Future where the pact was adopted. So it's very important that now, as Surya said, that they is need to have a shift in power in terms of policy making, have the children have to say what they want, give them a seat at the same table as the global leader. So I've noticed that globally, children are facing crises such as the climate crisis, wars. These are the people that are most affected by this crisis, but yet they are the least contributors to this crisis. When you talk about the war happening in Sudan, the climate crisis, the droughts, it's something that is being inflicted upon us as children due to conflicts, due to natural disasters, and yet we're not given the chance to fully say what we want and how we can solve issues. It's important now that the Pact of the Future was adopted, which acknowledges the vulnerability of children and acknowledges how they should be participate in terms of developing their different countries and communities. But now the issue now comes into the meaning for child participation. Because yes, child participation is there, but is it meaningful? We have this the creation of spaces for children, but they are only being there so that in the name of tokenistic approach, that it is said that we had children here, but were they given the space to speak? Were they given the space to challenge the thinking and the mindset that was put in place? So this is one thing that's not only happening in countries in Africa, but globally. We're having these spaces created, but only to have children be there in the name of being there, not having to voice out their issues. So my recommendation is that we need to move from words on paper to actions, have more open accountability space where we have to say this government has implemented this with the help of children, have children write their own reports on accountability to their different governments, because in as much as civil organizations, civil societies are helping and advancing child rights and participation in terms of development, we have to acknowledge that it is the government's responsibilities to be at the forefront of advancing such initiatives. Have a government have a delegation of children going to attend the summit, the COP, so that there is a clear representation of children. So that's all I wanted to say for now.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Nicole. And this notion that, children are the future and we listen to their voices, but do we actually do with anything we're listening to? I think the notion that you raised there of this shift in power is profoundly challenging whenever we're talking about really taking children's views, opinions, experiences, and feeding them into decision-making processes in a meaningful way. And I'd love to come back to this idea of open accountability spaces later on, because I think that's when you think it's when we think about how we do this, it's so important to look at the different approaches that are available and that have worked or haven't worked, etc. So thank you so much for that. I'm now going to turn over to our third speaker, and Neshan Gunasekara, excuse me, Neshan, who is from WIJA. He is a counselor. He is with the World Future Council. He is a visiting fellow at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, and he is co-chair of the Earth Trusteeship Working Group. Nishan, I know you were very involved in efforts around the Summit of the Future and in trying to strengthen the pact and the declaration, and it would be wonderful to hear about some of that experience now.
Thank you very much, Efe, for having me. And it's also a privilege to go in an intergenerational dimension as the speakers go. And it's, hats off to you and Surya for putting this together. It's a great honor also to represent here the World Future Council, which was set up in 2007, really looking at, as Surya put it, seat at the table, and for future generations at all decision-making levels. And of course, the United Nations being one at the regional level, the EU being another, and at the local and national and regional, at the kind of the municipal level being the others. And now I'll go back to some kind of comments that Surya made. You referred to the Brundtland Commission. And again, congratulations, Surya, for your report. I think it's timely. And I wish they had looked at it a little more in detail ahead of the summit, but we can get that into detail later. But specifically the work of the International Court of Justice in the mid-1990s. Now, I think the Summit of the Future, for me, did not happen in isolation. And as Surya mentioned, the SDG agenda set in tone, from 1987, there were developments till 2015. But the International Court of Justice plays a critical part in the development of what we call international law. Now, don't want to get too technical, but there are 38 references to international law in the Pact for the Future. And in the declaration, there's seldom there is reference. And there's also, as importantly, Surya pointed out, intergenerational equity. Now here, I really wanted to highlight the work of late Judge Christopher Veeramantri, who was a former vice president of the International Court of Justice and a founding counselor of the World Future Council. And he was on the International Court of Justice between 1990 and 1999, during which time he was part of really expanding the international legal jurisprudence from a kind of the 19th, 20th century mold to what it should be in the 21st century. And that is what we are discussing here today. And two cases, namely one on the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons, really delved deeply into the rights of future generations, including the impact the use of nuclear weapons have not only on the human species, but all on other species on our planet. And the second decision, a separate opinion that Judge Veeramantri wrote, was a decision in Gabjikova Nagimoro's case, where he unpacked the principle of trusteeship, drawing from the indigenous world wisdom. So that's the past. The present is this afternoon. I met with a fantastic group of young leaders from Mother Nature Cambodia, who, for their work in Cambodia, was imprisoned in Cambodia in July this year for fighting for rights of Mother Nature. And Surya referred to expanding these rights to include Mother Nature and Mother Earth, and I fully endorse that. And in that view, the Summit of the Future happens in this transitionary period where we try to implement a 21st century notion of international law, which has intergenerational equity as part of its principles, and that needs action-oriented outcomes. And 2 weeks ago, I was in Hamburg, where the senior advisor to the Secretary General announced that they will be taking steps in appointing an envoy on future generations, which is great news, but we are still waiting to see what process is followed. Last week, I was in the EU Parliament speaking ahead of the Commissioner Designate for Intergenerational Fairness, which is already a position agreed by the EU presidency and to be appointed after the 4th of November. And to the future of international law, we have the fantastic kind of example of young undergraduate leaders from the Pacific Islands now moving the whole world at the International Court of Justice on an advisory opinion on climate change. This is a great opportunity that we need to see how the Declaration on Future Generations is recognizing rights of future generations beyond the anthropocentric application in these cases, because there is a specific question on rights of future generations before the ICJ. I will leave my comments for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think, again, we see this theme of intergenerational equity and intergenerational justice being picked back up, which of course is a fundamental part of the issues we're looking at this evening. But I think also, Nishan, what you raised there, this kind of shift away from anthropocentrism, this shift away from the focus only on the human, is incredibly important. And it's something that really international human rights law, which is so person-centric and human dignity-centric, it's a struggle. Conceptually, it's a struggle. And I think that connects a little bit with what Surya was saying, about looking for non-human species. It's a connection again. It's about moving beyond this notion of humans are the only thing that matter, and we are our rights and interests and needs are the lens through which we address these problems. So I'm just trying to pull together some of the things we've talked about there, but very interesting and hugely important about this envoy on future generations, the scope of the role, what will that person do, and how does it fit? Sandy, may I now turn to you? This is Sandy Liebenberg will be our final speaker before we kick off our conversation. She is H.F. Oppenheimer Chair in Human Rights Law at the University of Stellenbosch Law Faculty. But I think crucially for the purposes of our conversation today, Sandy was also chair of the drafting group on the Maastricht Principles on the Human Rights of Future Generations, an initiative involving a range of experts, which has been hugely influential and important in terms of pushing forward thinking on literally what are future generations and what are their rights and what duties do they impose. Sandy, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Aoife, and good evening. Hi to everyone. It's a great honor to participate in this panel on what is really a crucial debate about what kind of world future generations will inherit. So as Aoife mentioned, I'll be talking on the Maastricht project on the human rights of future generations, which has been a large project which has been running since 2017, and it culminated in the adoption of the Maastricht Principles on the human rights of future generations last year in 2023 at the Center for Human Rights in Maastricht. It has been broadly endorsed by over 90 experts, special mandate holders of the Council, and so forth. But I think what it represents for the purposes of this discussion is the first detailed and systematic attempt to work out what it would mean and the legal basis of recognizing future generations as rights holders. So it really draws on all the sources that Neshan mentioned, those famous ICJ cases, but also broadly the law on sustainable development, looking also at indigenous cosmologies and worldviews, religious belief systems, really a hugely detailed consolidation of law and practice relating to the rights of future generations. And this is going to be reflected now in a detailed legal commentary, which is going to be published hopefully early next year, which really sets out all these sources. And I think really the important element of the Maastricht Principles is to also acknowledge how human rights law exists in a time span which recognizes how human rights violations transmit from the past to the present to the future. And those groups who were historically disadvantaged by colonialism, slavery, apartheid are most likely to be disadvantaged in the present and to transmit those disadvantages and human rights shortfalls into the future. And I think this is a very strong emphasis of the principles, this connection between intra- and intergenerational human rights obligations. So the principles also follow the typology of respect, protect, fulfill, which is very typical in human rights law. It gives illustrative examples of violations in respect of each of those categories. But I think, Aoife, very important for the purposes of our discussion linked to the Declaration and the Pact of the Future, it has a very strong section on remedies and accountability. And I think that is really the game changer of what it means to recognize human rights of future generations as opposed to needs and interests of future generations, which the Pact of the Future does. So it really looks at issues like legal standing, who has rights to bring cases to court, asserting the rights of future generations. The invaluable point that Nicole raised about participation, who can participate for future generations, and the special role of children and youth in that regard, and then the kinds of remedies which international, regional, and national bodies can give. So I think this is really going to, I think it's already through Syria's report and many other references starting to acquire arms and legs. And I think we are moving in the direction where there will be full recognition of the human rights of future generations. So I'll end my remarks there. Thank you.
I think that's marvelous. Thank you, Sandy. And I mean, I think this emphasis, and of course, many of us in this conversation, I can see amongst the participants, are lawyers. And so, Nishan made the point about, and Surya also made the point about the importance of duties, of legally binding standards. And when you're talking about remedies and accountability, and Nicole talked about accountability as well, this is fundamental because on the one hand, future generations' rights are meant to be a framework for how decisions are made, but we also need to have some kind of fallback where there's accountability and remedies, where there's a failure to take adequate account, to give effect to future generations' rights, as so helpfully outlined in the Maastricht principles. So those are a few initial thoughts. I'm going to now throw it open. There's a few questions already in the Q&A. I'd welcome others to do so, other people to do the same thing. There's one question which I'm going to address to you straight away, and it is from Maria Mercedes Rossi saying, in the preamble of the Pact for the Future affirms that to enhance the full enjoyment of human rights and dignity for all is a key goal in its implementation. And she asks, do you see this reflected in its 56 actions? So do we see an alignment between full enjoyment of human rights and dignity for all and what it's actually going to involve states doing?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for very, very useful exchange moderated by you, IFA. It's wonderful. I think the answer is both yes and no. I'm in fact, in New York, and only this morning I had meeting with several DPRs of developed as well as developing countries. And what they shared with me is this, that the Pact for the Future negotiation made polarization worse. States were fighting like quid pro quo. If you want this word, give me this in exchange. If you would like us to delete these words or sentences, you should delete that. So instead of agreeing on the big picture, common values that have been agreed for decades and decades in the form of UDHR and so on and so forth, states are still contesting those basic values. And that was quite regression in my view, that in 2024, states are fighting about those values and they are registering to include those in the Pact for the Future. And keep in mind, this is merely a pact. This is not a convention. So even in this soft declaration, states are fighting against those insertions. So that is the negative side of it in terms of no. But the positive is that definitely there are hopes in those action points in the pact. And I think, as Nicole mentioned, ultimately the question is about implementation. How do we take those words, even if imperfect words of the pact, to the next level and make them implementable? And I think that is where the question of accountability will come into picture. And if I could say that, we also need to think accountability beyond the courts, like the political accountability during elections, not only at the national level, but at the city level, at the village level, at the council level, at the sub-national and regional level. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Surya, for those thoughts. A question from Jackie Dugard, and I think I'm going to turn this to you, Sandy, actually. And Jackie is asking, it would be great to understand the relationship between the Pact, the Declaration, and the Maastricht Principles, and the extent perhaps to which there is one. So I throw that in as an added extra, just in case that gets things going a bit more. But certainly, Sandy, if you didn't mind taking that, I think that would be fantastic. And thank you for the question, Jackie. Can I say I can also see someone's hand up? We're not unmuting people, so please use the Q&A function if you can.
Great, thanks Aoife, and thanks Jackie for that question. So really the Maastricht Principles are not an intergovernmental process. They're primarily driven by civil society, academics, representatives of Indigenous people and so forth, building on the tradition of previous sets of Maastricht Principles, which I think pushed back the frontiers of international law in the fields of economic, social, and cultural rights, and then states' extraterritorial obligations, and now this intertemporal future generations. Whereas, of course, as Surya mentioned, the Pact and the Declaration are essentially the products of an intergovernmental process. But of course, we know that this kind of soft law can sort of crystallize, it can become customary international law, it can get taken up by human rights treaty bodies, be referred to by the ICJ. And that's why, at least personally for me, it's a disappointment that states were not yet prepared to make that step towards recognizing the human rights of future generations. But I still think that the research and the fact that it's been picked up in so many regional courts, you see it in the draft general comment of the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, recognizing human rights on future generations. Potentially this will be referenced in the ICJ advisory opinion on climate change. So I think it's more a case of the political process needing to catch up with where I think international law is heading on this question. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Andy. And indeed, I'm going to pivot on that slightly. One of the questions from someone who's anonymous is that, do you think the ICJ will recognize future generations as right holders? And of course, the ICJ has moved towards speaking about future generations in the courts like the Inter-American Court of Human Rights have moved towards speaking about future generations and decisions like the Caso Habitantes La Oroya and Peru. The ICJ has a question that the International Court of Justice has the opportunity in terms of what it's looking at to engage explicitly with the language of rights around future generations if it chooses to. But I think at this point, it's just not clear how they're going to approach it. But I would imagine if they do, as Sandy has said, that they will engage strongly with the Maastricht Principles. I have a question here for Nicole, who I think has rejoined us, which is wonderful. And Nicole, you've spoken a little bit about your experience in the Action Days and some of your concerns. And I suppose one of the things that immediately, struck me as I listened to that is, what do you think are the key challenges and obstacles when it comes to achieving your hopes from the summit, the things that you took away from the summit?
So the key challenges, I think, in terms of achieving my hope from the summit is how because now that we don't have accountability measures in place, how are governments going to make sure they adopt this Pact of the Future in their various countries? So it's very concerning because from one of the presentation, I've read that children are being arrested in terms of advocating for climate rights, for rights in general. So this is one of the things that is happening not only in the country that you mentioned, but globally. Children are afraid to speak up because they are being silenced by torture and being jailed. So when we don't have an accountability measure in place, how are we going to ensure that the pact is going to be adopted? That's one of the challenges that I think is very, very big.
Well, thank you so much for that, Nicole. I'm going to turn to another question because we've a number to get through. But that was very helpful and very clear. Thank you. And it's a question now from Dawiya Chalali. After 3, perhaps 4 decades of multilateral discussion on future generations, mainly through the lens and developments around sustainable development, we're at a point of momentum with the Summit of the Future on future generations at the multilateral level. And Dawiya is asking, what are the echoes and I'll take a couple of speakers on this, what are the echoes you have heard in your respective communities about the Summit of the Future and the Declaration? What impact has it had? How is it engaging with the work that your communities are doing? That's one question. The second question is, how do we make sure that we sustain the momentum around the Summit of the Future beyond the development of legal frameworks? Okay, so tying in a little bit with what Surya was saying about how we need to see political accountability and policy and policy changes as Nicole, and a power shift as Nicole shifted. So how do we make sure this momentum goes beyond the development of the legal framework? So for the first one, I think for echoes in your respective communities, Neshan, would you mind if I turn that over to you to have a sense of how that's shaped the work or engaged with the work of the communities you're involved in?
Sure. Thank you, Aoife, and thank you, Dawiya, for your question. So 3 aspects of the work. I mean, coming back to earlier question by Aoife as well. So apart from the Pact for the Future, another long process was something we supported called the People's Pact for the Future, which was adopted in Nairobi, where the UN Civil Society Conference was held. And this, in fact, refers to the Maastricht principles, trusteeship principles, and moving beyond the Anthropocene and including the ICJ jurisprudence. And this is more or less kind of an everyday discussion for the work of the World Future Council, looking at the past, present, and future of both institutional representation for future generations, but also discussing rights and duties of future generations, rights and duties towards future generations. So that's one aspect. And I think there are many aspects of the People's Pact that fell on the wayside in the 3-4 different iterations of the draft Pact for the Future and the draft Declaration on Future Generations. And the second aspect is kind of the regional and domestic level or national level discussions. So now these things are very important to look at because when Tony Opoza, one of the young lawyers back in 1993, walked into the Supreme Court of Philippines asking for stand-eye or locus standi for young people of future generations, the Supreme Court of Philippines took it on. But today, over 60, 70 countries has constitutional provisions on future generations. And we should not lose sight of these things. And these political leaders represent these countries. And if they have not read their own constitution, I think it's up to us to remind them. And it's not up to only lawyers and judges and people in the legal fraternity or diplomats to do this. Young people are doing this. And that is where we really need to bring the synergy between movements. And this is something I'm doing at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, looking at the socio-ecological movements, as well as young people's and climate movements, and bridging it with the work of lawyers. Because if it only is up to lawyers and judges, we are not going to achieve this. This needs a monumental shift, and the time is of absolute urgency. So I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Great, Nishan. In fact, I think you covered the second question there about sustaining the momentum beyond the development of legal frameworks by highlighting the different actors and processes we need to engage with. The next question has been phrased in terms of, it's directed to Surya, and of course, Nicole, if you would like to answer this as well, you'd be very welcome. Do you think that states, the governments would be more open to recognizing the rights of future generations and the rights of nature, so, of, say, rivers, etc., if we have more young politicians? Do we think that younger politicians would make governments more willing to recognize the rights of future generations and of nature? And Nicole, if you felt like answering it, great, but if you don't, please don't worry. Surya.
Nicole, do you want to go first or should I?
I think you can go first.
Okay, thank you. I think that is an excellent question. And in my view, that will definitely help. But I would also add more to that. if we could have more, let us say, indigenous peoples as politicians in the positions of power, we have more people who have been living in harmony with nature. They bring to the table, in addition to children, that will also change the dynamic. Because what I believe is that often the people who are holding the power, they represent the elite class who have very different interest than the interest that we are trying to promote here. So I think more diversity in terms of the decision makers will definitely add, and children and youth definitely will add there some weight to this recognition. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, Surya. Nicole, do you want to come in, or are you happy to pass on?
Okay, I'll come in. I think that it's important that more young politicians are promoted to have a say in what happens with the climate, because as the saying goes, that the older people are not, we're not going to inherit the climate, the land, and the world from the older people, but it's something that you guys are borrowing from us. So it's important that children speak for themselves and speak on nature, and that they learn, because most children often are glued to their phones, technology, and they are not even being exposed to the nature, exposed to the world around us. So it's important that young politicians are empowered so that they can bring in more young people to learn about the environment, so that we have a diverse of people bringing in ideas, and this will really help have a meaningful and positive impact in terms of preserving the environment.
Thanks so much, Nicole. Now you said in your answer there, you made reference to people, living on their phones, and I think we should be clear that that's obviously not just young people. I say as an older adult phone addict, but I do think there's an element of awareness and engagement, and I think that that's part of what you were getting at there, which is so important. But one of the questions raised by Adriana Giunta, who says, I do work with Indigenous peoples and importance of the right to education for Indigenous peoples, and the importance of their being able to transfer their traditional knowledge to their children and future generations. And she asks, what measures have been taken in relation to the right to education of Indigenous peoples and their future generations, particularly to protect their culture, lands, and environments? Nishan, I wonder, do you think you might be able to respond on that, given your work in the area?
No, thank you. And thank you, Adriana. I think that's a vastly important question, not only from point of view of where we stand at the beginning of the 21st century, but really trying to unlearn some of the things that this current economic model has thrown at us over the last 350 to 400 years since the Industrial Revolution. And the violations happening to Indigenous communities, especially their culture and knowledge, being taken away, is one of the gravest crimes that are being committed. And still there is not sufficient engagement on this. But I'll refer to a couple of developments that are useful. In the Latin American and the Caribbean region, there is what is called the Escazú Agreement, which looks at environment and indigenous rights and participation, which also recognizes right to education, cultural heritage, which includes memorial heritage, because it's not just the books we're talking about parts of nature, which is part of educational heritage of Indigenous people. And another example, which is vastly inspirational, is from Aotearoa, New Zealand, where there's co-governance mechanisms between Mount Taranaki, and we're recognizing mountains having legal status before court as entities, and riverbeds, waterfalls, and so forth, which is championed by Maori elders through Indigenous as well as intergenerational dialogue with the New Zealand government. And over the last 10 to 15 years, this is a growing area where, as I mentioned, mountains, rivers, and so forth have been recognized as part of the heritage of those Indigenous people having equal right, not as rights being given by humans, but rights in it itself having entities. And that is something we need to unpack, that it is not for humans to give rights to nature, that the nature by itself has rights. And this is, principle of Katiakatanga, which comes from the Maori spiritual world, which cuts across, across the world of indigenous peoples, because there's spiritual wisdom in these legal principles. These are not only spiritual principles, but legal principles. So I think it's about time we learn from these things, and this is something we are championing through something called the Earth Trusteeship Initiative, which is bringing together different coalitions between indigenous communities, legal and social ecological movements. And finally, the point that Ife and Surya mentioned, that the International Court of Justice has this opportunity now. And it'll be important to see how many indigenous leaders are represented in the delegations to the International Court of Justice by the member states. Because remember, this case was agreed to by all the member states of the United Nations through a consensus resolution 29th March last year. It's very important that include indigenous world leaders in their delegations.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. I just want to go down. Pradeep Narayanan has asked a question. And Pradeep says, there's no doubt that the rights of future generations is important. I have 3 questions. Okay. And I think Sandy has already kindly said that she will engage with these questions, which are absolutely vital to all of us, but I have to pick on someone. So the first question is, how will this pact be also a way to make a paradigm shift on the very understanding of human rights, which certainly have been criticized for being largely individualistic and neoliberal? So in fact, is the focus on future generations going to fix some of the problems that we have with human rights? Second, how could the pact bring the reparation debates back in a concrete way? And third, does the proposed pact require an anti-colonial reading? Sandy.
Great. Thanks, Pradeep. I think those are really great questions. And I think this is why the future generations discourse really does bring challenges to traditional liberal individualist conceptions of human rights, also concepts of rights that are sort of embedded in, ways of relating to nature, where nature is seen as something to be exploited, and, extractivist, industries and so forth, and sort of growth paradigms that are seen as unlimited and can make endless inroads on nature and its ability to sustain all human life equitably. So I think it has enormous potential to do that. Of course, like all rights discourses, it can be misappropriated. You can sort of fall into a discourse of saying it's only the future that matters and what happens in the present, and what's the power relations of the present are not important. But what I think the Maastricht Principles does such a good job of highlighting is the intertemporal dimensions of human rights, the interconnections between past, present, and future, and that those future generations whose rights we are concerned about, who are threatened by current, are usually the descendants of communities, indigenous people groups who have been historically disadvantaged. And I think particularly if you look at the provisions in the Maastricht Principles on equality and non-discrimination and positive measures, very much there's an emphasis that one would need reparations for past injustices to avoid those injustices being transmitted to future generations. So I really do see it, along with this very fruitful dialogue with the rights of nature, that it really can shift sort of liberal individualist paradigms of human rights. Thank you.
So much, Sandy. And of course, then, from the past to dealing with the past through ensuring intragenerational justice, which we hope will, of course, then transfer into intergenerational justice in future. There is a question for Nicole, but I think she's not with us at the moment, so I'm going to throw it out to others. And I think Gamze Erdem Turkeli is asking a very important question, and Gamze is raising a really important stakeholder, shall we say, that has been touched on, but is enormously important in the context of the right to development, but also in the context of creating obstacles to enjoyment of the rights of future generations, and that is business. Because international human rights law remains very strongly state-oriented, and we've spoken a lot about governments, we've spoken a lot about political decision-making processes, but ultimately, business is sort of off to the side, wielding extraordinary amounts of power, having incredible influence, and it's not massively well captured. In fact, it's frequently not captured at all by the international human rights law standards and accountability mechanisms at the international level, and frequently at the domestic level as well. So I think bearing that in mind, throwing it open to speakers, particularly, I think I'm going to throw this out to you first, Surya. What should accountability look like for the rights of future generations? And who ought to be accountable? States, businesses, or others?
It's an excellent question, Aifa, and I would say that all of those, it's not either or. I think governments have to be accountable. But I strongly believe that international human rights law has to evolve as we are trying to evolve it to capture future generations, right? It also has to evolve to impose obligations and ensure accountability of the non-state actors like businesses. In fact, I will be organizing another event as part of this development dialogues in Geneva on the 26th of November, and that will precisely focus on this question about corporate human rights due diligence and the rights of future generations. So the focus is going to be that businesses must start looking at, as part of their due diligence, the impact of their projects and activities on the rights of future generations. Let us say one concrete example I can think of is deep sea mining. If we allow deep sea mining at this point of time, that will impact not only present generations, but also future generations, and also non-human species, marine life. And I think the accountability will follow from those processes, in my view. Because if they have an obligation and if they don't do it well, they have to be held accountable at various levels. Thank you.
If you are muted.
Sorry, there's always one nitwit, and it was me again. Sorry, right, unmuted now. A final question now, because I think Nicole isn't rejoining us, and there is another question for her, but she's not here, and I'm conscious we're getting to the end of our time. And this is, again, from an anonymous participant, and it's about more projects, especially in the form of blue economic initiatives, are coming to the spaces protected by the indigenous peoples over the centuries. All of these are done in the name of development. How do we place or locate these issues when we talk about climate change and future generations in relation to nature? Okay, so existing development narratives focus more on the commodification of nature, whereas indigenous peoples are more focused on the protective and sustainable use of natural resources. Often these people are not adequately represented in power structures. Now, that's both a question and a comment. I think it ties in with an observation that was already made by Surya around the lack of representation of indigenous people. It connects, I think, very strongly with what Neshan was saying around perceptions of nature and the sources and developments around the rights of nature in different parts of the world. But how do we, I mean, maybe I'd slightly rephrase that question and say, how do we deal with the fact that we have this extremely dominant development narrative that runs explicitly counter to the rights of nature, and to a large degree runs explicitly counter towards meaningful protection for the rights of future generations? And I think perhaps we'll finish with that question, and then does anyone in particular want to take that question? I'm not sure.
I can briefly start. I think this is a fundamental question in my view. The current model of development is the reason of many challenges the world is facing. And I believe that's why I'm proposing a new alternative, not people-centered development, but planet-centered participatory development. And I will stop here because Sandy and Nishan may wish to jump in. Thank you.
Sure, happy to both compliment what Surya said, but this discussion has been really inspired by indigenous communities across several generations, and I think it's really important that we reassess our educational systems and re-inform ourselves of that wisdom. And here, a couple of examples why the Sustainable Development Agenda was moving in the multilateral UN system, which many indigenous communities do not necessarily recognize because they have a separate idea on sovereignty and statehood. There is also movements such as the Earth Charter, which was adopted in the year 2000. The Earth Charter was one of the most participatory, contributory pieces of documentation, which I think should be afforded as part of customary international law today, and which really talks about the counter narrative, which requires to be incorporated into the development sector. And it obviously has been hijacked. And it is an opportunity to reconnect with Mother Nature, to know where the different parts of an electric vehicle actually is coming from, and that it is actually coming from indigenous lands. And you remove that from them, you remove education, not only for indigenous communities, but for whole of Homo sapiens species. And I think that realization has to be done urgently. And that's what there are different synergies of these different movements that I see coming together, and we have very little time to get it right.
I think that's an important point. I suppose there's one additional thing that I want to flag as well, that today we've heard extensive discussions around future generations. We know that they are very, one of the positives that comes out of the Pact for the Future is that it is explicit that future generations are all those generations that do not yet exist. One of the things that I think can make it very complex dealing with future generations' rights at the national level and indeed the regional level is the fact that it's often not clear what future generations are, even where they're accorded constitutional protection. And so I think it's very important that when we think about future generations and we think about the rights of future generations, we think about who we're talking about, but also future generations in the near future, future generations in the distant future. These will have their rights, their needs, and their interests will be different. The challenges they face will be different. And we need to bear in mind that when we're thinking about the rights of future generations, that it's sufficiently flexible context or definition to go beyond contemporary challenges that we regard as most pressing. And I think one of the things that I very much enjoyed about this conversation is that we focused on development. And we've come at this from a very broad perspective, because often when we're talking about future generations and the challenges they face, we do so only through the climate crisis, which of course is an existential one, but the rights of future generations is a doctrine that has to survive beyond simply the climate context. So I very much welcome, and I want to congratulate and thank the speakers for having taken this broad approach, bearing in mind that first, the rights of future generations has to be broad, and we're still coming from a situation where at the international level lots of things are happening, but at the national level it's not always clear who counts as a future generation. Anyway, I'm throwing that in there as a final comment. We are at 6 o'clock. I think we can take 2 more minutes if that's okay, and I'm going to give everyone 30 seconds to just throw out any final thoughts they might have. So let me start with you, Nishan.
Sandy didn't speak. I'm happy to go after Sandy. If that
Sandy
is
very generous. Sandy very generous. Who said she didn't mind. But Sandy, if you would like to take it away now, that would be great.
Yeah, no, I think, this webinar has really covered and, stimulated by Surya's report and the work of Nishan and Nicole, really that the issue of future generations pose profound questions for our model of development, for our concepts of human rights, for our relationship with nature and so forth. So it really, it comes at a very important juncture in the world where I think the human rights agenda and the environmental agenda are facing multiple threats. And I think by focusing on future generations and nature and that interrelationship, we can really hopefully sort of reimagine a better future going forward. Thanks, Aoife.
Thank you so much, Sandy. Nishan.
Thank you. I fully agree with Sandy, and I again go back to my initial comments on the intergenerational aspects of our engagement, our education based on principles of international law, and really understanding that human species are part of the wider community of life on our one home planet. And I think the faster we realize this and bring this meaningfully to challenge the current economic model and to bring it out, and I say this because Nicole is not here, to remember what she said. We have borrowed this planet from her and the generations that come after her. We do not own it. And I think it's faster we realize it, it's better for them and the generations to come. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Nishan. And Surya, for you, the last word.
No, I would like to just thank all the co-organizers, Nottingham Human Rights Law Center, the World Future Council, as well as the Child Rights Connect for collaborating with my mandate. And I would say that let us continue this collaboration. Let us pick up a couple of concrete case studies. As you mentioned, Aifa, we could go beyond climate and environment issues. Let us say new technologies, for instance, how they will impact future generations. And let us do more work on this issue together. Thank you very much for the opportunity of this collaboration.
That's wonderful. Listen, and may I add my thanks to Surya, to Sandy, to Nishan, to Nicole, and of course to Surya, to himself, and to everyone and Safarak, who has done such a wonderful job supporting this event. Thank you all so much for joining us. The video will be online very shortly. The next development dialogue, I'm sure you will be contacted about and receive information on. But thank you, and have a wonderful afternoon, evening, very early morning, depending on where you are. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.